your perspective, why do history and fantasy play so well together? And then on top of that, in your case in particular, how does something like mythology or religion play into that?
Um, Off the top of my head, and I really hope we demolish this hypothesis by the time we're done, because it is off the top of my head, I think there's possibly two aspects to it. The first is a very lazy part, which is that history arguably is already a very well constructed world in which we can then go play. One of the
Mm,
challenges of writing any imaginative work is creating a convincing and meaningful work, and you take inspiration from wherever you can. History is already a very well studied tapestry from which you can then go in and magpie pick all sorts of bits and bobs. And yeah, I hate to use the word lazy, but as someone who loves picking from history, it's incredibly satisfying to sit down with the world of history and go, this is interesting and this is brilliant and this is fascinating. What happens if I poke at that? It's this wonderful playground of stories and cultures and fascinations that already exist to be looked at. I think the other part of it is that historically, fantasy has in many ways been humanity's oldest form of storytelling. Like, we've been
mm,
telling tales of wonder since Gilgamesh. We've been telling tales of kind of mystery and high imagination since, kind of even the earliest kind of Indian stories, like kind of the dawn of kind of the Bhagavad Gitas and all of that. And so in many ways, we're as a species, I think, already quite well geared to enmesh the imagination in our world and to kind of look at our world in an imaginative way. But given how much of our storytelling has been imagination in historical context, I think it kind of makes sense that we're still doing that, that we're still looking at the history not just of the world, but the history of storytelling and the part that fantasy has played in that and sort of smashing them together like an old cake. I suspect it's much richer and more complicated than that, but that's my opening bit.
I appreciate that you use the analogy of a cake, Claire. That's very poignant. But I
It's
like
a
what you mentioned
terrible
about like
analogy, but you know what I mean.
a historical cake. Just smash it all together. But I like what you said about storytelling because I think there is something there. It's like not only is there the history of cultures and places and um, oral storytelling and written storytelling and visual storytelling are all very integral in terms of how those cultures and histories develop. So it's like as storytellers, it's very interesting to have this uh, dual approach of I'm telling a story using the stories of the past, and then blending that together in order to create a more fantastical narrative. Rebecca, I'll toss it to you to get your thoughts on this.
Oh, I would just add that, I think for me, and perhaps for other marginalized communities, where we have not been the tellers of history, um, I think writing fantasy for me is often a chance to sort of reclaim that history. So, I don't think a lot of people learn about like the history of the pre-Columbian Americas, and sort of the advanced civilizations that were here and that, still exist. The sort of progeny of those still exist. And many of the things we take for granted, at least here in America, come from the agricultural and sort of civil advancements of those civilizations.
Hmm.
And so writing fantasy is a chance to sort of tap into those in a way that's like entertaining and not hopefully sort of pedantic. And maybe get people interested in learning about the real thing. Like one of the things I include in the back of my novel Black Sun, since it is so sort of pre-Columbian history inspired heavy, is a reading list of books by historians and others that allow people to go in and actually learn the history of the Mexica or the Maya or the ancestral Puebloans. And so
Yeah.
that's really important to me, this sort of revisioning or reimagining, I should say, of history through fantasy, which I think can be very
Hmm.
powerful because of what Claire said, the storytelling aspect of it rather than sort of the lecturing aspect of history.
Yeah, very true. And what you said brought up this video that I saw recently about Indigenous American Sign Language,
Mhm.
and for me personally, it's like I grew up with sign language. Both my parents are deaf, so I can speak ASL fluently. But something I didn't realize is that so much of what modern American Sign Language is based on comes from indigenous cultures and the sign language that they used with each other in everyday life, but also on the battlefield as a way of silently attacking your foes and being able to communicate just through visual. So all these different things, and it's like you're right. There is this reclamation aspect to it that is really important, and I think fantasy is a good vehicle for people of marginalized backgrounds to be able to say like, "Hey, the things that you take for granted today, our history is united in the sense that all these different interstices pieced together over centuries make up the modern fabric of
Right.
America or England or whatever country there is." And fantasy is a really amazing way to highlight that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Ed, Ed, what's your take?
Okay, so like a sticking out sore thumb maybe. I'm obviously a white British man, and is there anyone whose story needs less telling than mine? No, is there a better documented like long history that's been done over and over, particularly in fantasy, than that? So I think that's really interesting what Rebecca's saying there, because it actually throws up a really interesting contrast between the different purposes you can have. There's no value to me trying to retell the War of the Roses
Sorry, George.
or similar. It's all been done so many times. What I try and do with my writing, I use history as a backdrop, but I use it quite the opposite way. I'm not trying to show new things. I'm using history as what's familiar, because I want to explore some aspect of fantasy, something which is out there and not known to us and is different. And therefore, for me, Daughter of Redwinter is a kind of pseudo Scottish medieval backdrop to events, which I want the reader to feel that these clan names, these rolling moorlands and wilderness, I want the reader to find those familiar, because they, for me, are the grounding point from which then all the crazy magic stuff that's going to happen is the bit that I'm trying to focus on. So rather than trying to show the reader something that history has missed, I think I'm using history in order to be the comfort food, so that when the spice comes in, it's a little it's different. And I always say that fantasy is it at its best. Fantasy explores modern day real world issues, and it does so by isolating them from the rest of modern day society. So, for instance, in one of the themes in the Redwinter is the idea of men who are incels, and they've always existed in one form or another throughout history. It's just we have a word for them now.
Yeah.
But I isolate that through the familiar, if that makes sense. So yeah, it's an altogether different approach. But honestly, no one needs to hear the history of medieval England yet again.
But I think you're playing with that. I don't even know if I would call like English history like a trope in fantasy at this point, because it's just so well tread in terms of historical ground. But I think the way that you approach it is really cool, because you're playing with something that's familiar, but you're approaching it from the perspective of like, how can I make this fresh and interesting, but also reflective of what we're experiencing today, and concepts that we're aware of today that weren't really existing back then, right?
I think that's what every fantasy author who really wants to say something is doing in one form or another. We may be writing about history or historically themed ideas, but people are people.
Yeah.
And they've been weird in the past, but they were still people.
I think humans today are even weird too. And Vaishnavi, what's your approach in terms of, the ways in which fantasy and history play so well together?
Yeah, so for me, I'm approaching my writing talking about religious ethics of a religion that's still practiced today. And
Mhm.
so for me, I'm approaching something that some of the world would view as purely fantastical, talking about demons and gods and their great battles, but another portion of the world viewed as pure history, like it definitely
Exactly.
happened exactly like that. And so for me, writing what to me kind of feels like historical fantasy and sort of blending the two is my way of sort of reconciling these elements that are possibly not historical and yet are believed to be. And it just raises a real question for me of how much of history is belief and how much of history is fact. I mean, we never actually know for sure that things that happened the way that they did in history. I mean, that's why we see so many battles over exactly what happened. You can't say for sure. So at some degree, we all believe that history happened the way that we think it did. And so even our beliefs about how history happened in certain ways are people's fantasy. And so for me, that's something that I end up thinking about a lot. I also think that what Rebecca said about using that history as a way of reclaiming some of that history, and as an entry point and including resources for people who are interested in that time period are all definitely things that I resonate with, and I think Rebecca does much, much better. So I'll just add my little religion belief part to this.